When you think about the Enlightenment, you usually think of progress, right? Science, art, society, all marching forward, getting better and better. But there was this one philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who took a hard look at the modern world and asked a pretty wild question. What if all this so-called progress has actually made us miserable? So let's get into his head and try to understand his profound and, let's be honest, very challenging vision for society.
This quote right here, it's everything. It's the key that unlocks his entire philosophy. For Rousseau, all our problems, inequality, competition, misery, it all started with that one moment, that simple act of claiming ownership. That, he says, was the end of innocence and the beginning of our very broken world.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We're going to trace this radical train of thought from the beginning. We'll start with the man himself, then explore his idea of a lost paradise. We'll get into how it all went wrong, and then we'll dive into his big solution, the social contract, the super mysterious general will, and a final conclusion that, trust me, is a real shocker. To really get Rousseau's ideas, you kind of have to get him first. He was never a comfortable insider. He was a man of huge contradictions, and it was his own life experiences that really shaped his unique and often prickly way of looking at the world.
So Rousseau's early life in Geneva was tough. He eventually moves to Paris, which was like the center of the universe for Enlightenment thinkers, but he just never really fit in. The big turning point, though, came in 1749. There was this big essay contest asking if the arts and sciences had improved humanity. And look, everyone was supposed to say, of course, but Rousseau, he wrote the exact opposite. He argued that they'd corrupted us, and he won. With that one defiant act, he basically became Europe's most provocative and controversial thinker overnight.
And that contrarian spirit is central to his whole deal. See, to figure out what was wrong with society, Rousseau felt he had to imagine what humanity was like in its original, pure state. He called this the state of nature.
Rousseau imagined early humans as noble savages. Now, savage here doesn't mean brutal or violent, it just means uncivilized. And noble is the important part. They were noble because they had these two natural qualities that made life happy and pure, long before we invented all our complicated stuff like governments, laws, or property. Life back then was simple. People had perfect freedom, guided just by their own needs. They also had a natural sense of pity or compassion for each other. The only inequality was physical. Some folks were older, some were stronger, but the whole idea of rich versus poor just didn't exist. Nature provided everything, so everyone was completely independent.
And this contrast right here is the absolute core of Rousseau's argument. On one side, you have the happy, free state of nature. On the other, you have civil society, our world, driven by competition, vanity, envy, and that huge artificial gap between the rich and the poor. So the question is, how did we get from that first column to the second one?
According to Rousseau, we didn't just stumble out of paradise. We were tricked. The creation of society wasn't some noble agreement for the common good. It was a clever con, orchestrated by the powerful to protect their own interests. Here's how he says the scam went down. First, private property shows up and creates inequality. This leads to vanity and competition, because now people are comparing what they have to their neighbors. Then comes the masterstroke. The rich, worried about losing their stuff, convince the poor that everyone needs laws and a government for protection. The poor agree, not realizing they're basically voting to lock themselves into a lower status. And just like that, a flawed society is born. One built not for everybody, but to protect the stuff the rich already have. But Rousseau wasn't just here to complain. He had a cure. A really radical, all-or-nothing social contract that he believed could destroy the chains of inequality and create a new, truly moral kind of society. This right here is the heart of his solution. Unlike other social contracts where you give up a few rights to get some security, Rousseau's version demands total surrender. Every single person gives up all their rights, all their power, their very identity, to the community as a whole. No holding back. And this is maybe the most radical part. The individual basically disappears, absorbed into this new collective organism. You're no longer just you. You're an inseparable part of a much bigger whole. And this new community is governed by one single supreme force, the general will.
So what on earth is this all-powerful general will? It's probably the single most important and definitely the most misunderstood idea in all of Rousseau's work. Let's try to break it down.
Okay, in the simplest terms, the general will is what the people would want if they were thinking about what's best for everyone, not just for themselves. In Rousseau's mind, it's always right, it's always rational, and it's always aimed at the good of the entire community. To get this, Rousseau says we all have two wills inside us. There's our actual will, that's our day-to-day selfish impulse, the what's in it for me voice, but we also have a real will, our higher, rational self that knows what's truly good for everybody. The general will, then, is basically what you get when you add up everyone's real will. And the implications here are huge. The general will isn't just a majority vote. A majority can be selfish, right? It's not even the will of all, if they're all thinking about their own private interests. It's this more pure, abstract idea of the common good. And because it's your own true will, Rousseau says you can't just hand it over to a politician or a parliament. The people have to be directly involved. This all leads us to the final, most controversial, and honestly the most unforgettable part of Rousseau's philosophy. It's a paradox that has had people arguing for centuries. So let's think this through. If the general will is always right, and it's always for the common good, what happens when you, as an individual, don't agree with it? What happens when your selfish, actual will decides to rebel? Well, here is Rousseau's shocking, unforgettable answer. If you refuse to obey the general will, the community doesn't just have the right to force you to comply, it has a duty to. And in doing so, he says, they are doing nothing less than forcing you to be free. Now, how in the world does that make sense? Well, for his logic to work, you have to remember his two wills. Since the general will is just your own higher, rational, real will, when you disobey it, you're not being free. You're actually being a slave to your own worst, most selfish impulses. So by forcing you to obey, the state is just liberating you from your lesser self. It's making you act in line with your own true freedom. And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is Rousseau's social contract a brilliant blueprint for a truly moral and free society where we all become our best selves? Or, by claiming that the state can force someone to be free, did he accidentally write the perfect justification for tyranny? That's the paradox of Rousseau, and it's something really worth thinking about.